The view stateside, we cross live to our correspondent in Washington, Dina Gusovsky. Hello there, Dina. So how is this story playing out in the U.S.?
Well, in an effort to convince Moscow that NATO is no longer a threat, like you said, the Obama administration says it's possible for Russia to join. Assistant Secretary of State Philip Gordon told lawmakers that option is not off the table as long as Russia meets the criteria. But like you said, these comments mark a stark difference from what we heard from Joe Biden just a few days ago, where some people would believe that the U.S. doesn't even need Russia. So, is this just political rhetoric, or does this represent a change in foreign policy on behalf of the Obama administration? Well, there are certainly those who say that Barack Obama is completely different from George W. Bush when it comes to foreign policy, and yet others say it's more of the same. One of those people, James Joyner, he's the managing editor of the Atlantic Council. It's a public policy think tank here in Washington, D.C., and he joins me now. Thank you so much for being here. So you wrote an article about Obama's foreign policy,
right,
and you titled it Bush's Third Term. I mean, you heard the lead-in, you heard the NATO. Doesn't this mark a stark difference?
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. I mean, Bush was very early in his term, had looked into Putin's eyes and read his soul and saw a kindred spirit, and it turned out not to be the case in terms of policy. Obama is definitely a rhetorical shift from Bush, and you've seen that in the Pew poll and some other sort of polling that's been done out there. Clearly, people have the perception that he's different, that he's less belligerent, that he's more open.
And isn't that so important in politics? When we talk about politics, perception is key, right?
It's helpful. But the question then is what do you do? Having that image gives you the ability to, in fact, maybe make a policy change. But then do you follow that up with actual substantive movement? Ultimately, I think that Russia's interests in Americans... I don't think so. I think Russia's interests and American interests are pretty much what they were 6 months ago. They haven't changed just simply because you've got a new president in the White House.
But given Iran and the situation in Afghanistan, do you think that the U.S. and NATO need Russia now more than ever?
I don't know more than ever, but certainly, Russia's participation would be helpful. The question is what does Russia want to do? Does Russia see it in its interest to help the United States to take some burden off? What can Russia really do with regard to Iran? And what does Russia want in exchange?
Well, experts say could do a lot, that the U.S. really does need Russia when it comes to
maybe, but presumably, a nuclear Iran is problematic for Russia as well. Russia has not done much, whether because they don't deem it in their interest, contrary to what it would seem, or because they can't in fact do much. They don't have that much leverage. It's unclear, but Russia hasn't really made any movement in that regard.
Well, let's talk about Afghanistan for a second. The first stage of the Helmand Province offensive is completed, and now officials are saying the next step is actually to talk to, possibly negotiate with local Taliban leaders. This is not something that we heard under George W. Bush. So how do you justify your claim that basically we're seeing the same thing, even when it comes to dealing with Afghanistan?
I think what we're seeing is a continuation of the Bush policy.
You think that Bush would have come out and said, let's talk to the Taliban leaders?
I think so. What had been happening is the Bush's leadership is basically in place. We've got still got Bob Gates at the Pentagon. We've got General Petraeus now, at Central Command. Stanley McChrystal was brought in to take charge of the Afghanistan mission by those two gentlemen. So I think, yes, very much we're continuing the policy that had sort of gone underway. The Bush policy had changed radically from 2003 to say 2005, and it had gone unnoticed because the nature of presidencies tend to be that nobody admits mistakes, nobody will admit that they've changed anything. So it's like, oh no, this is the same policy we've had. But it was in fact a remarkably different policy toward the end of the Bush administration.
But when we talk about policy, we also have to talk about the end goal. And the Bush administration seemed intent on this idea of kind of, liberating people and bringing democracies towards people. We've had this debate. What is the U.S. trying to do in Afghanistan? Because if the end goal is to build a democracy, experts across the board say it's not going to happen.
That's right.
So if their end goal is different, then how does that shape the policy? Because you're right. there are the same people in charge when it comes to Gates and the commanders on the ground, but it has to be a transition, right? I mean, if Obama's end goal is different than Bush's, then are we going to see in the next few years a completely different foreign policy?
Yeah, I don't know that the end goals are decidedly different. I think certainly Bush initially had incredibly ambitious goals for both Iraq and Afghanistan. That yes, there were going to be these great beacons. We're going to democratize them, and this is going to create some sort of a domino effect, if you will. And
do you think that Barack Obama is kind of smart enough to not go that route? Because it's failed in the past.
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know if he's got any particular experience. He's surrounded himself with good people, and he has, I think, a more or less realist mindset about foreign policy. Which, again, toward the end of the Bush administration, once you had Condi Rice had sort of come into the ascendancy, once Gates had taken over for Rumsfeld, Cheney had sort of moved off to the sidelines. You largely shunted the neoconservatives, out of the Bush administration in terms of serious policy influence. So I think Bush had long since quietly changed his goals in Afghanistan to something more realistic. And it's still not clear what exactly the goals are, but it's certainly much less than the goals in 2001, 2002.
So do you think that the U.S. is going to be stuck there because it's not clear what the goals are?
I think that we're going to be there for a while. I think regardless of what our goals are, there's nothing that we're going to do in the short term. I think both McChrystal and Gates have basically said we need to sort of see some progress take place in the next year or things is going to fall apart, both in terms, mostly because the NATO allies are moving out of the mission. But I think we'll be there for a while.
Right, and that's definitely not something that the American people or soldiers on the ground are looking forward to. But it's always an interesting debate to have. Is Barack Obama a continuation of George W. Bush, or is he going to make some drastic changes? Back to you there in Moscow.
All right, indeed. Thank you very much for that, Dina, and thank you for your guest.